Perfect. Awesome. As I was saying, we're in the third of a three-part series. We have two returning champions from our clinic number 2, Beth Schenk and Matthew Eckelman. They're here again. Matt to talk about carbon accounting. Beth talk about her experience on other scope 3 issues. Today we're going to talk about business travel, investments, fuel and energy, leased assets, and carbon offsets and waste. Matt's going to talk about accounting. Beth and I will talk about what we're doing in our healthcare organizations on those topics. We covered scope 1 and 2 in the first one, and we covered other aspects of scope 3 carbon in the last session. So again, thank you all for being here. These are our speakers and the organizations that we're from. I'm going to have each of us give a little intro as we join. Matt will go first, then Beth, and then myself. So we're going to give an overview. I've completed now the overview of the clinics. Matt's going to talk about carbon accounting tools and resources to do that carbon accounting. We'll talk about Providence and Cleveland Clinic's implementation models, and then we'll leave 30 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand the baton off to our carbon accounting expert, Matthew Eckelman. Matthew, please take it away.
Thanks very much, John, and nice to be with you all. I'm going to share my screen here and hopefully it comes up for you. All right, how's that looking?
Good.
Good, thank you. All right, so my name is Matt Eckelman. I'm an associate professor of environmental engineering. I'm at Northeastern University in Boston. My job is here to talk about the greenhouse gas protocol, the actual accounting standard that most people use for carbon accounting at an institutional level. My background, of course, I'm not coming at this from a clinical perspective. I don't work in healthcare, but I'm a researcher in environmental and emissions accounting. So I've done work at a national level, doing some of the big studies for US healthcare emissions. And I've worked with a bunch of different hospitals and health systems in different parts of the world, including with the NHS in the UK. And I'm, as John had alluded to, part of the Decarbonization Action Collaborative with the National Academy of Medicine. So for those of you who were here for part 2 of this carbon clinic, we're going to do a quick showing of some of these initial slides just to kick us off. And then we'll get into these different categories for this clinic. All right, so just to set the stage for those of you who are new to carbon accounting or logging on for the first time here, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard divides carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions into 3 scopes, 3 kind of groups of emissions in terms of how they're generated. Scope 1 and Scope 2 that was covered in the first carbon clinic. These are direct emissions from your hospital or healthcare organization's own facilities. Scope 2 would be emissions associated with purchased energy, electricity, but also steam, depending on your situation. And Scope 3 is all the other indirect emissions, both indirect emissions associated with upstream activities and downstream activities. And so it's kind of the kitchen sink area of this accounting protocol. And it can cover a lot of different things. So we call these value chain emissions. They might occur in a wide variety of locations and also from a wide variety of sources. So for example, emissions associated with upstream production of drugs or food or medical supplies. Yeah, so cleaning supplies, all sorts of upstream emissions, but also things you might not think of in your value chain. For example, cloud services, computing, or testing, right? Offsite testing, or the construction of the building that you're in. So it's really different categories in terms of how emissions take place. And so as a result of that, we're looking at a pretty diverse set of categories in the Scope 3. This is a picture I'm showing here of US average emissions for the entire US health system, health sector rather. And what I want to emphasize here is those direct emissions from scope 1 and the emissions associated with energy that you purchase, scope 2, those are, important but relatively small compared to the scope 3 emissions, which is everything else here. Right, so just to emphasize, this isn't for any specific hospital, this is just the US average. But you can see some of these important scope 3 categories like food and pharmaceuticals, transportation and energy. So this scope 3 emphasis is really important because we can see that it's driving emissions in the sector. And in order to decarbonize, we're really going to need to tackle these value chain emissions. We've looked at this breakdown over time. It's been pretty consistent over the last decade or so, again, showing really the dominance of these scope 3 emissions. So again, what we'll do today is follow this standard from the greenhouse gas protocol. Both upstream emissions, last time we covered purchased goods and services, capital goods, and just transportation and distribution. This time, upstream will be covering fuel and energy, waste, business travel, employee commuting, upstream leased assets. And then on the downstream side, unbolded are the things we covered last time. This time we'll be covering downstream leased assets, franchises, and investments. Now, some of these categories really make sense, right? For example, waste or business travel, or employee commuting when you're talking about a healthcare organization. Some of them may not make sense depending on your situation, for example, franchises. So I'm going to go through the protocol, and if this applies to you, hopefully those category explanations will be useful. But don't worry if your organization doesn't really fit the mold for this, some of these categories. All right, so let's jump into that first category of upstream value chain emissions, which is upstream fuel and energy. So this category, I've included the definition from the greenhouse gas protocol in all cases. So it's related to the production of fuels and energy. You've already counted the emissions associated with combusting or using that energy. That's part of your scope 1, or indirectly in terms of electricity production, that would be included in scope 3, scope 2, excuse me. But these emissions, these scope 3 emissions, are associated with producing the energy in the first place. And here are some examples, right? This is a bucket wheel excavator for coal mining in open pit coal mining. And this excavator runs on energy, right? Could be diesel fuel, for example. So burning that diesel fuel releases emissions. In oil and gas drilling, this is an oil rig. Sometimes the gas is flared, so we have CO2 emissions from the flaring. Sometimes the flare doesn't work, and so you have direct methane emissions, which are invisible. You have to use a special camera, so that's what you're seeing on the right side. These methane emissions taking place from a gas processing facility. So all of this is happening upstream in the generation, the actual extraction of energy. In addition, we distribute that energy around. And so here's a picture of Boston. I'm based in Boston here. And what you're seeing here is a picture of all of the gas leaks in natural gas distribution. And this just indicates that, yeah, we're losing some methane, the main component of natural gas, in its distribution between where it's produced and where it's actually consumed at your hospital site, for example. Not just that, but we also have energy losses related to electricity. The transmission and distribution of electricity, it's not 100% efficient. We do have some losses, what we call line losses, and we need to account for those as well. So this category is a little bit complicated, and I'm going to go through all three of these situations where you have upstream emissions from purchased fuels, upstream emissions from purchased electricity, and then emissions associated with those electricity transmission and distribution losses. All right, so we'll go through each of those. In order to understand the differences here, we're going to use three kinds of emissions factors. You've already talked about emissions associated with fuel combustion, and you use that in scopes 1 and 2. Okay. However, for scope 3 purposes, we have two kinds of emissions factors. One is just the upstream energy use. So what we would call a cradle to gate emissions factor for the energy producer. And that's, for example, from only the production and transmission of energy itself. And then we also are going to use what we call a life cycle emissions factor, which is both the upstream generation and use and distribution, as well as that combustion related factor. So I'm going to be very clear about this when it comes up. I just want to note that. All right, so let's jump into the steps here. First thing, you should go to your scopes 1 and 2 reports, determine how much fuel and electricity you're using, right? Then you're going to collect the emissions factors that you need depending on the situation. For energy production in the United States, actually the US recommends we go to a UK government report, which is very clear, easy to access report. But for line losses, for transmission and distribution losses, actually the US has its own very good information. So here's some data sources for that. And then once you have the energy inputs and emissions factors, it's just a simple multiplication problem. All right, so what we'll do now is to go through several examples to demonstrate this. All right, so example 1 is about natural gas. So here's the situation. Maybe your healthcare facility uses 1 million cubic meters of natural gas annually. So you collect that information from your natural gas bills. So that's the first step here. Second is you need to find a well to tank emissions factor, WTT, well to tank. And what I'm showing you here is that document from the UK government, which you can navigate, find the emissions factor for natural gas. You can see the unit here, kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So this includes all greenhouse gases per unit. And the unit you want to find here in this row is cubic meters. So here's your emissions factor, 0.34 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per cubic meter of natural gas. All right, so those are the upstream emissions from producing natural gas. And then all you do is multiply those things together, and you get 343 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's your upstream scope 3, category 3 emissions for natural gas. All right, so hopefully that's very clear. The next one's a little bit trickier. This is related to electricity. All right, so let's say the situation, your facility uses 1 million kilowatt hours of electricity annually. So you need to find an upstream emissions factor associated with that electricity. So this is emissions associated with the production of the fuel that's used in the power plants to generate the electricity. Or it could be upstream emissions from hydropower plants or other renewables. This is actually a pretty difficult factor to calculate. So often when I'm doing this, I use a US average. It's about 11% of the direct combustion emissions factor for that region. In the United States, we have different grid regions, and these regions are kind of delineated differently by different agencies. The most common approach is to use this tool called eGrid, which is from the US EPA. And they delineate these regions. So just find your region. I'm here in Boston, so I'm in the NEWE eGrid region. And I would go to this eGrid tool and look up the table here. All right, so I would find my New England region and the emissions rate for direct combustion related emissions. This says it's in our fun US units of pounds per megawatt hour. So 533 pounds per megawatt hour, and I want 11% of that. So I just do the simple calculation, convert to kilograms. I get 0.027 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour of electricity use here in New England. Okay, then I just again multiply. So I get 27 tons of CO2 equivalent. That's that upstream fuel-related emissions or even upstream renewables emissions associated with electricity use. All right, hopefully that's also pretty clear. Now, the last example has to do with transmission and distribution losses, and this has a few more steps. Same step one, you figure out how much electricity you're using annually, and then you can go again to eGrid and find this other factor. It's called the grid gross loss factor. So this represents the percent of energy lost during transmission and distribution, and you can see for New England it's about 5.3%. Okay, now what I actually want is this factor that tells me per kilowatt hour consumed, how much electricity is lost, essentially what's the extra amount of electricity that has to be generated. So there's a little bit of mathematics you have to do over here, but it turns out it's about 0.056 kilowatt hours of lost electricity per kilowatt hour that you consume. All right, now we want to figure out what are the emissions associated with that lost electricity. Okay, so first figure out of your 1 million kilowatt hours, what's the kind of extra electricity that was lost that never got to you, but that was generated. And just as before, figure out where that electricity came from. I'll use the New England region again. And unlike the previous example where we were just interested in the upstream emissions associated with the fuels or the renewable plants, now we want to include the combustion as well, because that loss in the transmission and distribution happened with electricity that had already been generated. So those emissions from generation already occurred. So we want to account for them. So I have my 533 pounds per megawatt hour. That's about 242 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. That's the combustion or direct emissions. And I want to add to that the upstream fuel cycle emissions that I calculated in my previous example. Okay, so now I have my life cycle emissions factor associated with both the production and the generation of electricity and its upstream fuels. 269 grams of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour. And then finally, again, I just multiply how much extra electricity was needed to compensate for the losses, and then the life cycle emissions factor associated with that electricity. I convert to tons. It's about 15 tons. So very typically what you'll see is that the upstream emissions associated with the electricity that actually makes it to you is going to be a bit more than the indirect emissions associated with these transmission and distribution losses. In our case here, it's about a factor of 2. Okay, so I know we're saving questions to the end, so I'm just going to proceed through the next several categories. I think this one's probably the most complex, but I'll go through the other categories of Scope 3 accounting and then pass it off to my colleagues here, and we'll come back to questions. But if you do have any, please save them for the end, and I'm happy to answer any detailed questions here. All right, so the next category is waste management. So emissions from treatment and disposal of both liquid and solid wastes. So typically in the healthcare sector, we're used to incineration emissions. But for liquid waste, for example, that goes through wastewater treatment, you'll have biological processes and also some decomposition processes that will emit CO2. Sometimes methane is emitted, sometimes nitrous oxide is emitted. So we want to account for those downstream emissions from waste. All right, for those of you who attended Scope or the second carbon clinic, we actually covered this. This is the same directions as category 12 that we had. And in this case, where you just follow some very simple rules. typically, most facilities will know how much of each type of waste they're producing. So you can estimate your material quantities, figure out what's happening to it. Is it getting incinerated? Is it getting landfilled? What's the situation in your particular part of the country? And then here's a set of emissions factors. It's essentially CO2 equivalents per ton of waste of each type. So it's very straightforward. There's no need to go through a detailed example here. And hopefully that's clear for those of you who have tried this already. All right, but happy to answer questions about it if you'd like. Next category is perhaps a bit more popular to report. A lot of facilities in healthcare are already talking about employee commuting, and also some of them are tracking business travel. I've lumped these both together because the method is essentially the same. All right, so there are three options that you have for these methods. One option is if you're tracking the amount of fuel that is being used either for business travel or employee commuting, you can use that method. I don't know anybody who does that because it's just hard to get that information. Much more frequent is the second option called a distance-based method. So you'll know how far people are flying or taking the train, and you'll calculate the distance associated with each trip, or for your commuters, your employees, the distance, kind of average distance they're coming from their homes to work, and you can use that information. If for whatever reason you can't get that, let's say it's too expensive to do a survey of your employees, well, then there are some average factors that you can use. Okay, for the exercise here, I'm going to use a distance-based approach. All right, so let's say you know that there's some business travel that's happening by train. So first thing you want to do is figure out how far. So you kind of compile all the travel emissions, let's say 10,000 miles by train. That's carried out on the East Coast. This might seem strangely specific, but when you go to look up the emissions factors from our US EPA, you'll notice that it depends on what part of the country you're in. The Northeast Corridor is an electrified train system, right? Whereas some other train trips that you'll take will be with diesel locomotives pulling the train. And so you'll want to account for those differences. Here I've pulled these factors from that same US EPA site I've been referencing a lot. And you can see that it's reported for each specific greenhouse gas, CO2, CH4, and methane separately. All right, so as you've done with your scopes 1 and 2 emissions, you want to translate each of these into your CO2 equivalents, and then just multiply by your distance. So here we have 10,000 miles. And then here's my factor for carbon dioxide, 0.058 kilograms of carbon dioxide per passenger mile. And then I have 0.0055 for methane, but please be careful. The units for methane are different. They're reported in grams instead of kilograms. Okay, so in the calculation here, you can see I'm adjusting with this factor of 1,000 to translate to kilograms. And I have my scaling factor for the global warming potential of methane. And then same thing for nitrous oxide. You get a total 583 kilograms CO2 equivalents. All right, so hopefully that's very clear. Next category is kind of a funny one. Not all healthcare organizations are going to have upstream leased assets or downstream leased assets or franchises. Okay, so upstream leased assets, that's where you're leasing from somebody else. Downstream leased assets, that's when you own the asset, your organization, and you're leasing it to a different organization. Okay, so both of those situations you would want to report. Franchises, I couldn't really think of a good example in the healthcare space, but perhaps there is one for certain types of clinics or maybe dental facilities or something like that. Okay, now this is actually pretty easy. It's just like doing normal scope 1 and 2 accounting, but instead of collecting the data for your own facilities, you would just collect it from either upstream or downstream leased assets or from franchises, right? For upstream leased assets, if you're paying the utility bills for the space that you're leasing, then you have access to those data pretty readily. For downstream leased assets, you may have to talk to the people that you're leasing them to. So just as a reminder, this is counting both fuel and electricity use and steam, if that applies to you. Scope 1 emissions also include leakage of refrigerants and waste anesthetic gas emissions. These are second one's pretty typical. The third one is of course specific to healthcare. Now, the global warming potential associated with all of these types of emissions and fuel use, this is all again in this EPA emissions factor site and very straightforward, especially if you've done scopes 1 and 2 accounting, you're used to this, but you just report it in a separate place. You report it in these separate scope 3 categories. Okay, finally, the last category is investments. And this is, again, not one that we're often used to dealing with in the healthcare space. It's just being started to be reported by some organizations, often larger ones. But I want to go through it because it can be an important driver of scope 3 emissions. You can see from the category description here, it says this category is applicable to investors and companies that provide financial services. So it's really meant for financial institutions like a bank. And it wasn't designed explicitly for hospitals or healthcare organizations. But of course, many HCOs have their own employee retirement plans and even pension funds. And so, I want to go through this category because it may be applicable. All right, so there are certain types of investments that you're required to assess in this category. So any equity investments, any debt-related investments if it's for a known project, right? So you've acquired debt for some kind of specific project. But if you've acquired debt and it's not for a specific investment or project, then that's actually optional to report that. It's not required. If you're engaged in project financing, that's a required report input into this category. This won't apply to many HCOs. And then if you invest, if you're managing someone else's investments, this is also an optional category or an optional input into this category. Okay, I think equity is the easiest one to understand. So I've built an example here related to that. There are two approaches to investment-related carbon accounting. One is that you use some specific information related to the investment itself. And one is that you use some average data related to the sector that the investment is in. Okay, so I'm going to do one example from each of these approaches to make it pretty clear. All right, so here's the first example. I'm going to do the investment-specific one first. And yeah, here's the situation. Let's say my HCO's employee retirement fund has a $10 million investment in Coca-Cola. All right, now Coca-Cola is a huge corporation, obviously, and they do their own reporting about their emissions. But first, we need to understand what portion of Coca-Cola's overall equity is represented by our investment. So you can go look up in any financial tracker, the total market capitalization of Coca-Cola, $206 billion. So our 10 million equity share, it's about 0.005%. Right. So because this is an equity aspect, it's like we own 0.005% of Coca-Cola's emissions. And we're going to report that in our Scope 3 report. Next, step 2, you try to find Coca-Cola's emissions. Like many large corporations, Coca-Cola reports their Scopes 1 and 2 emissions and also some Scope 3 to various places, including the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a very popular international clearinghouse for these kinds of reports from companies. So I pulled this from Coca-Cola's latest report. So here's the Scope 1, about 800,000 tons of CO2 equivalents, and about 750,000 tons for Scope 2. In total, about 1.5 million tons. And our portion of that is about 0.05%. So about 75 tons of CO2 equivalents. All right, so that's how you go through this very specific example for a specific investment. Now, it's unlikely that your HCO is going to have just one single equity investment. It's much more common they'll invest in some kind of mutual fund, or they'll have dozens of different specific equity investments. So in that case, you would have to do this dozens of times to cover all the different specific equity investments that your HCO is making. And that's certainly doable, but it can also be kind of time consuming, and not everybody has the resources to do that. So another approach is what we call the average data approach. And in this case, you would just look at all of the investments in a certain sector. So let's say $10 million in the beverages sector. So this could include Coca-Cola, but also Pepsi and all the other beverage companies that you have equity stakes in. Okay, so in this situation, you would go to a different location. You're not going to look at a specific corporation anymore. Now you're going to look at the entire sector. So here you're going to try to find what's called an EEIO, or Environmentally Extended Input-Output Emissions Factor, for that sector. In the United States, those factors are generated by the EPA. Okay, so I've put a little link here for a table that includes all of the supply chain, or what we think of as these EEIO factors. And I've extracted the table that's for the food, beverage, and tobacco sector, right? So, so we have that kind of aggregated sector, and the units are different. Here, check out the units. We now have kilograms of carbon dioxide per dollar of investment in 2018. Okay, so 0.325 kilograms of carbon dioxide. You can see the other reported greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. So again, as we have done before, you want to translate that into the CO2 equivalent factor using their respective global warming potentials. I'm using 25 and 298 here, but there are some updated factors from the latest IPCC report if you'd like to use those. And you'll notice that the CO2 equivalent factor, it's actually quite a bit higher than the carbon dioxide factor, right? It's almost so almost a factor of 3 higher. And this is because for food and beverages, it's mostly based on agriculture, and methane and nitrous oxide emissions are just a much more important driver of agricultural emissions than in other sectors like manufacturing. Okay, so you have your overall CO2 equivalents per dollar of expenditure in 2018. Then again, it's just a multiplication exercise, but you need to adjust for inflation. So if you're doing carbon accounting that's using these input-output factors, you need to adjust. Let's say you're doing this for 2022. You'll basically use inflation factors to deflate your expenditure back down to 2018 dollars. So if you're spending $10 million today, right, that's going to be worth something different in 2018 dollars. So you just have to deflate that to the appropriate amount, and then multiply by our CO2 equivalent factor that we just pulled out from this table, and you'll get this number. 8,230 tons. Okay, so if you remember the previous factor, you might be kind of wondering, wow, that's so much higher. That's like a factor of 100 higher than the equity-based approach that used the specific investment factor for Coca-Cola. And the reason for this, well, there are two. One is that, of course, this average is for all food and beverage companies and tobacco companies in the United States. Coca-Cola might have very efficient operations, so their emissions may be lower per unit of output than the overall sector. The other influence is that these EEIO factors, they include all upstream emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3 from this beverage and food and tobacco sector. Whereas the factor that we used from Coca-Cola specifically, that was just scopes 1 and 2. So we're actually being more comprehensive here in this method of carbon accounting for investments. All right, so that's the approach. This is just for your investments in food and beverages and tobacco. You would look at all the other sectors that your mutual fund or what have you invests in, and do the same exercise for each of those. Add them up and deliver that as your category 15 scope 3 accounting results. Okay, I think that is it for me. So I hope this was useful for you as an overview. I'm happy to answer any detailed questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eckelman. And I'm assuming I should just move ahead here, John and Jason.
Yep.
Okay, just 1 second. I'm going to share. Thank you all, and it's nice to be with you again today. My name is Beth Shank. Let me double check. Can you see my slides and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Beth Shank, the Executive Director of Environmental Stewardship for Providence, which is a large health system I'll tell you a little bit more about. A nurse by background. I'm also a faculty member at Washington State University College of Nursing as an assistant research professor. So for the Carbon Clinic number 2, as Dr. Eckelman said, we covered the primarily purchasing elements out of the greenhouse gas protocol. And those were for us much more challenging because they're more vague, at least for what the data that we can get. And I stated that essentially. So for these, everything but investments, we have a much easier way of measuring and reporting and tracking, and therefore they're more actionable. So we have focused on these quite a lot, and I'm going to show you how we're doing that. Just a sec. Okay, so just a quick reminder about Providence. Large health system, 7 Western states, 120,000 employees, 52 hospitals, 950 clinics, etc. These are the 7 Western states, and there's quite a lot of variation between Alaska and Texas, say, or the coastal states and the Rocky Mountain states, etc. But we're all in the West. And in 2020, we did set a moonshot goal to become carbon negative by 2030, and we're working madly to make progress on that. It's been a great effort and a great amount of fun, I have to say. So we're doing really all that we can to reduce emissions in all the categories that we can. And as I hinted at, some are more actionable than others. And we're measuring this and reporting this internally right now using our WEACT framework, which you can see here, and the WEACT scorecard. So today I'm going to be showing you the scorecard screenshot of the scorecard to demonstrate how we're doing this, all the stuff that Dr. Eckelman just went through. Again, referring to the greenhouse gas protocol for really everything constantly. If electronic documents could be dog-eared, this one would certainly be dog-eared for me. So as mentioned, the first category we're going to talk about is category 3, fuel and energy related activities. And Dr. Eckelman went over these 2 methods that are outlined in the protocol. And what we're doing is using the second one, the average data method. And we're doing this in a way that's quite easy for us once we have our tool set up. And I'll show you that in a moment. And that's because for all of our energy work, we have, these almost 1,000 buildings, 40 million square feet, a lot of energy and water use data. And we use a company, a partner, Schneider Electric, to help organize that through a bill paying strategy, which then pulls the data off of the invoices. So we get usage and cost data instantly every month. And so we're able to pull that in then to our scorecard through API, and then also to bring in the upstream loss data. So that comes to us every month per site, per commodity. So for electricity, from Schneider, they're using, just like Dr. Eckelman said, the EPA eGrid T&D loss for each eGrid region. For us, that adds up to this amount of metric tons, 12,500 for our acute sites. So everything I'm talking about today is for our acute hospitals, because that's what we're measuring right now. We know that that represents about 85% of our total energy use. And so we typically think it's about 85% of all categories. But we're learning more about that now, and I'll tell you about that when we talk about our non-acute strategy. And then for natural gas, similarly, they are using the emission factor number from DEFRA. That's the UK database that's similar to EPA that provides emission factors. And that for us is 31,000. It's quite a bit higher as a percentage, the T&D losses for natural gas, than it is for electricity. So as an example, so I'm just going to explain how this scorecard works. And I know that you can't read all these numbers, you don't need to. But we have this set up so that on the left, we list our different elements that we're tracking. This is the carbon emissions page. We also have usage and cost pages, but this is for carbon emissions. So on the left, we have whatever it is that we're tracking for carbon, and across the top, we have all our hospitals. They're alphabetical, so you see we're up to the C here, and it goes on and on for 52 hospitals. But it comes in every month, and this is showing you an example of 2022, and you can see the two categories: electricity upstream loss and natural gas methane upstream losses. So those come from those sources that I just described through our Schneider partnership, which is terrific. Okay, going to the next category. This one is actually quite complex for us. We've really dived into waste for a number of reasons, and I know that many healthcare institutions struggle with this, trying to wrap our arms around it and trying to see, well, where is it going and how much is it? So we are using the third of these methods, the average data method, which Dr. Eckelman highlighted. And what we're doing is we have built our scheme and our process here. And I need to explain this in order to explain how we're tracking it. So our waste goal is to divert more than 50% from landfill or hazardous streams by 2030. And we have devised this basically strategy. So we consider these three big buckets: disposed waste, that's the stuff that gets treated or is not diverted; diverted waste, compost, recycling, universal, donations, there are some subcategories. And most important is the avoided waste. And this is important because this is how we get back to our supply chain issues. So I'll talk to you more about that. So all of our waste together is all three of those big buckets: disposed, diverted, and avoided. So we have done a lot of work with data to be able to track how much we are creating in each of these categories. So I've got big circles around the big categories: disposed, diverted, avoided. We have many subcategories. This comes in from vendors across the US West, basically, and also from our invoices. Some of it comes to us that we are able to put through Schneider, their database, the invoice payment system that I was mentioning, and others we track manually. So this is a significant effort, but there's a lot of interest in waste. We wanted to understand it better. We're trying to drive down our waste for good reasons, one of which is the environmental impact of the waste treatment itself, and the other is back to that avoided waste in the first place. This just gives you an idea of the robustness of the data that we have for every site every month since January 2019. This is just an image of one of our comparisons pages, the waste comparison page. And across the top, we have these different buttons that you can push to get different metrics that give us normalized data so that we can compare apples to apples across our sites and year over year. So the one that's black is highlighted, and that's waste optimization. And that's basically, if you look down at the bottom, that's our waste goal. That's the number we want to be over 50%. And so that is, by doing this calculation, you see, diverted waste plus avoided waste in the numerator divided by all three, disposed, diverted, and avoided in the denominator. So right now you can see there's a dotted blue line. You may not be able to read it, but it says 22. And this is for 2021. But our average waste optimization percent in 2021 was 22%. And you can also see that there's a hospital above 50 already. We've had actually several that are above 50. They kind of go up and down right there. Quite a few in the 40s. So we know this is possible. And we know that we already have examples in our own health system from different sized hospitals in different states, et cetera. So we think we're on the right track here to be pushing our waste, first of all, to be going to the right place, because we also know that we can save significant dollars by doing so. And most importantly, for reducing what we bring in the first place. So let's see. So we do use the average data method, and this is a screenshot of our emissions page. What I had shown here was our normalized data page, and what I showed before was our cost and usage page. So this is a screenshot of our emissions. So we're looking at each of these treatment categories. So, and these we believe are all of the ones that at least are relevant for emissions, because otherwise there's donation, there's avoided waste, but these are the ones that we can measure based on pounds produced. And this is, again, using the EPA GHG Emissions Hub. It's a great document, another one that should be on your favorites list. And we do our scorecard, which is the Power BI platform, does the calculations for this. And so we end up with an emissions amount in metric ton CO2 per site per waste type. We do it per month, but what I'm showing you here is an annual total. So what we saw, for example, in 2021, and I'm reporting 2021 because we won't have our 2022 until the end of February, mid-March, was 22,000 metric tons CO2. That's for all of our hospitals. By comparison, for all of our hospitals, our nitrous, which we talked about last time, is 11,000 right now for 2021. Our volatile anesthesia is closer to 3,000. Our business travel, 500, and our reimbursed miles, which is for when people drive their own car to do business, about 1,000. So this is, if we're going to go to the trouble of treating any of these, then certainly we need to also treat waste. Now, it's small compared to our energy, which is closer to 400,000, and our investments about 400,000. But nonetheless, this is actionable. And also because of waste, it's important as an engagement piece, because everybody talks about waste. Everybody wants to understand it. Everyone's concerned about it, because 91 million pounds of waste in Providence in 2021 hospitals, 91 million pounds ran through people's hands. So it becomes a big, it becomes important to people to consider. And it turns out it's important for the emissions, it's important for the cost. But the big reason we say that we really want to do this is for the avoided waste, because we don't know how else to draw attention to it from a data-informed perspective. So with our avoided waste, we're actually measuring. We're measuring the waste that is not there, which I realize sounds like an oxymoron, but we do that by estimating, for instance, or getting values from our vendors, like many of you do for reusable sharps containers. We get a poundage from that, tons. For the amount of dishware that, when we're using reusable dishware, the amount of disposable that would represent, we calculate that. Same with reusable isolation gowns, we calculate that. So we're trying to collect more and more examples of ways that we have avoided waste in the first place. That other program I told you about last time with the surgical supply reduction, many, many thousands of pounds of waste avoided with that. So we're trying to build our own awareness of that, to push people upstream to be thinking about this, because we're clearly not going to solve our consumption problem with recycling or composting. We're going to solve it by changing the way we approach supplies. So we feel like we're getting some amazing data that we could be able to share more. Okay, moving on to business travel. Oops. Dr. Eckelman talked about all the three ways that the protocol suggests, and we use the distance-based method. So it's a little bit complicated, and we work closely with several of our bigger vendors. We have a travel platform because we have so many people, and so they go there just like you'd go to Expedia or somewhere and book your flights there, book your hotels there, book your rental cars there. So that's great. That means that we have a single source, mostly. Some people don't do that, but mostly, and they're supposed to. Mostly we have a source for this data, and we get reports from the vendors. So for flights, we get the number of flight segments, the class, is it first class, business class, or economy, the distance traveled, and a report of the emissions. So we pull that right in for flights. For rental cars, it comes in from several different sources, but in the end, we get the number of miles and the miles per gallon. So we do that calculation as well. For reimbursed miles, which is a piece of business travel that's required by the protocol, we get the number of miles because the employees have to report that to get reimbursed, because that's the IRS rate for mileage reimbursement. And then we have a regional, for our regions, Providence has 7 regions, an emission factor for our commuters. So we use the same emission factor, assuming that the employees are driving a similar sort of, tranche of vehicles. And so we have all these calculations built into the background. So once again, we get monthly totals for usage and cost and carbon emissions. Hotels is optional in the greenhouse gas protocol. We have included it, and we do that based on the number of nights because we get that from our travel platform. And then we've established emissions factors for the most common hotel chains we use and an average for any others. So that too comes in. It's fairly small, but it comes in and we're tracking that. So this gives you an idea of where we are. And as I already showed on the prior slide, our business travel for 2021 was 535 metric tons and reimbursed miles about double that. The first is more actionable than the second. So we're really working on and pushing on our executives to continue to keep a cap on business business travel, because we can do things like this. It really works. Our virtual workspace really is working. Reimbursed miles is a different story, and we're talking with our home and community care folks about that, about ways can we make sure that we're being efficient with our mileage, et cetera. Employee commuting is really a hard one. It's hard one to move the dial, and it's hard to measure. So again, these are the categories that Dr. Eckelman described, and these are all available in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance document. And we use the distance-based method. Now, we have set up a rather complex survey. It doesn't look complex on the outside, because it's only, I think, 8 or 9 questions, but we ask people to report how many days a week they go to work, what they're driving, what's the distance, et cetera, how often are they sharing vehicles, or and with how many people. So then that is calculated into essentially an emissions factor. So we do this for all employees, but we also have other surveys available to us. For instance, Washington State requires commute trip reduction surveys every other year. Portland, Oregon requires a TriMet, that's their transit system survey, et cetera. So we take all of those and pull together in a rational format, which is way too much to explain here today, to create emissions factor per employee in these different regions. So we end up with 7 different emissions factors for our 7 different regions, and then we calculate that based on FTE, which means it goes up and down a little bit based on how many people are currently employed in a given month. So that then also comes into our scorecard, and you can see it along the bottom there. It dwarfs all the other numbers for transportation. There it is. And in fact, it's nearly 100,000. So that's substantial, quite a bit more than waste, 4 times what waste is. It's about half of what electricity is or natural gas. And so we work on this, but it's difficult to work on because, people love their cars. It's hard to make these changes. We have commuter support, we have a lot of transit support, and also we're really trying to encourage the transition to electric vehicles. We think that's basically the main way we're going to reduce our emissions, and our goal is to reduce emissions from commuting by 30%, which is very ambitious. I'm not sure about that. Okay, then we have these 2 categories of our leased assets, as Dr. Eckelman explained, and we treat these essentially like the rest of our building assets. So the asset-specific method is what we're using. So I showed you that whole thing about our acute sites, the scorecard, and we have all our sites running across the top. We are right now in the process of onboarding 615 non-acute sites. This is complicated work, obviously, but we're getting them all into the Resource Advisor platform, Schneider Electric's platform, and then pulling it back into our own through API to start with, to make sure that we have the right square foot, the right ownership categories, to see what clinics or services are in the building, and also the energy and water data, including upstream losses, et cetera. That's where we're starting. We will probably get to some of the other scope 3 elements, including waste, employee commuting, and business travel, and that may be about it. Many of those are owned assets, and some of them we lease out from someone else, and we also lease some of our owned assets out to other people. So it's the upstream and downstream. We're basically treating them all the same. We're gonna pull the scope 1 and 2 data in just like we do the others, though we'll report it in these specific categories. So because we have that partnership with Schneider, and because we have the scorecard, this is manageable. It would not be manageable otherwise, because it's so much. Now, what we've talked about last month and this month, or last session and this session, is what are we doing as well? And so just a very quick run through of these categories. So our We Act categories really align well with the greenhouse gas protocol, not line for line, but you can say which one goes into which of our categories. The reason we use categories like this is because it's a lot easier for people who aren't in the weeds of this stuff to think about the practical world of waste rather than category 6. So we are doing our waste optimization work, a lot of data tracking, as you can see. And then this past year, 2022, 2021, we created our waste optimization playbook. 2022, we did assessments for each site and developed action plans. And now 2023 and 24, we're asking all sites to get all their waste streams in place and organized. And then we've got from 2025 to 2030 to get that number up above 50%. For energy and water, always, like all of you, working hard on efficiency. And so we're doing energy and water audits at a number of our sites. Those are a commitment, and they yield, great insight into what can really be done. And then also we have a renewable electricity procurement strategy. So we're always working on that, whether through local green tariffs, through PPAs, et cetera. And that's how we think we will get to 100% renewable electricity. Agriculture and food, we have 3 main focuses to reduce the carbon intensity of meals, and we're using many of our sites, 80% of them use a company called Morrison, and they have a product called the Carbon Food Print, and we're also putting those on to the Healthcare Without Harms product of the Cool Food Pledge. Also, to reduce food and packaging waste, we have food waste reduction on the prep side through Lean Path and Waste Not 2.0, et cetera, to really drive down the waste. Then we have composting, and we're building that up wherever we can. And then also working on packaging, which is challenging, especially because we backslid during COVID. Basically, we went to more disposables. And then the third area of work is through healthy, sustainable foods, and that's measured by sustainable local quantities, percentages, and also chemicals in foods. Our chemicals in terms of greenhouse gases are primarily related to anesthetic agents and nitrous, but we're also really interested in chemicals of concerns in our products and supplies, DEHP, PVC, mercury, et cetera. So we're chipping away at that through our purchasing. And then the T, I've talked about quite a bit, our commuter work. We have an EV charging strategy work going on right now. A lot of sites are really jumping at that, trying to get things installed, and we're trying to kind of rein that in to say, what's the best practice? We currently don't have a centralized fleet vehicle management program. We're proposing that, putting that forward. We think that will help us a lot to track our fleet. And then we're asking our executives to set a cap on business travel, because we're doing quite well because of all of this.
Excuse me, Beth, I just wanted to do your 5-minute warning.
Thank you so much. And then the last category is investments. And as Dr. Eckelman talked about, it's, well, what I say is this is not for the timid. And this is something that we got a lot of help with. Nothing I would feel comfortable taking on. So we went to our investment teams, companies that help manage our large portfolio. I think a helpful way to think about these investments, it is equity investments, and it is our retirement funds, and it is our health plan funds. And we have a whole bunch of categories where, good sized sums of money sit. And Providence is a $25 billion company. That means $25 billion of revenue every year. And our finance people say, you know, we really need 6 months of operating. And so that's $12 billion right there. So it adds up to a lot of money that we're shepherding and stewarding. So we worked with our investment firm to do an assessment of our investments in 2021, and we'll be doing it again this year. And it was in alignment with the protocol. I learned so much going through that in all those categories. And we really did it using the average approach across by sector. So just like Dr. Eckelman explained, it would have been the second one of his example. So we looked at all of food and beverage, for instance, and then used their emission factor more or less to apply. So we found that it was 20% of our entire footprint, as mentioned, similar to all of our energy use. It is substantial. We also, what are we doing about it? Mostly, we have some input on our investment strategy, and that's really through our socially responsible investment committee. Being a Catholic healthcare organization, we are bound through our relationship with the Catholic Church for a few things to avoid investment in. You may not be surprised, guns, for instance. We're not going to invest in guns. We're not going to invest in abortifacients, anything that would cause an abortion. And what our investment committee has done has also included care of our common home. So that means an environmental lens. So in the mid-teens, they divested from coal, for instance. So we don't have any coal as an energy source in our portfolio. That doesn't mean we're fully divested from all fossil fuels. But when I've looked at our categories, it's interesting that I believe I didn't look at this just recently, but it's about 4%, I believe, that would fall into either a utilities sector category or an energy sector category. So like 2% each. So it's not a lot that's directly invested in energy, if in fossil fuels, if any. I don't know that because I don't have that granularity, but I hope to learn more this year when we do this again. But one thing that tells me is because our footprint is still so big, over 400,000 metric tons, that's partly because of the nature of our economy. Our economy and all of our markets are dependent on fossil fuels. So you can't exactly pull out of all fossil fuels, but you could pull out of companies that are primarily based on fossil fuels. So we're learning more about this one all along and trying to do good with it. And this is just my final summary. I like this quote. The goal is to turn data into information and information into insight. So this part of the scope 3 categories are much more, like I said, we understand this a lot better than we do the purchase goods and services. And we have real data. We have actual monthly accurate and transparent data that is now serving as a way that we can not only understand our carbon emissions, but understand how to better run our buildings, how to aim for efficiency, how to use this information to tell compelling stories and back it up with real data that really happened at our sites. So happy to answer questions later too. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. I'm turning my camera on and going live. Hello, everyone. John Utek, Cleveland Clinic. Thank you to both of our speakers. I'm now going to share my screen and talk a bit about Scope 3 at Cleveland Clinic. Here we go. And please let me know, Beth or Justin, if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right. Clicky, here we go. Okay. So again, my name is John Utek, Senior Director of Sustainability Strategy at Cleveland Clinic. Been in this role for more than 9 years now, so I've learned a thing or two. Happy to have all of you attending and learning more about this really important topic. I'm from Cleveland Clinic. We are a international healthcare organization with locations primarily in Ohio and Florida in the US, but we also have a facility in Nevada and Toronto, and we operate hospitals in Abu Dhabi and London. And more than 72,000 employees, we call them caregivers. Everyone at Cleveland Clinic is a caregiver, whether they're directly involved in care or not, because we're all responsible for delivering care directly and indirectly. We generate more than $300 million of research funding, more than 10 million patient visits a year, and there's 21 hospitals under the Cleveland Clinic health system. So I'm going to start with this, which is, we did scope 1 and 2 in the first session, and I detailed out Cleveland Clinic's scope 1 and 2 footprint. By the way, all of the numbers I'm sharing, or most of the numbers I'm sharing, are from our 2019 footprint, just sharing methodology. Our 2019 data was actually calculated by a third-party consultant. So in my view, it's the most, it's the one that's been sort of third-party verified, if you will. Our scope 3 footprint is 5 times larger than our scope 1 and 2 footprint. So more than 2 million tons in scope 3 versus 400,000 tons in scope 1 and 2. And you can see that our scope 1 and 2 is primarily electricity and natural gas, these two blues, and then also anesthetic gases and steam and fuel. For scope 3, the big drivers, almost half is our purchased goods and services, which were covered last time. This orange slice is capital goods. Again, that was covered last time. Today, I'm actually organizing my talk from biggest to smallest in terms of impact. So investments, employee commuting, fuel, and transmission, waste, and business travel. And when it comes to scope 3 investments, actually are 34% of our scope 3, okay? And in terms of the methodology, we use the average data method to calculate this. And just to make this simple, lots of not-for-profit healthcare systems have investments in the markets. The way that this was generated is through our own regulatory obligated public filings, whereby we disclosed what our investments were for the year end of 2019, which was $6.5 billion of equity investments. Our consultant at the time used year end 2017 greenhouse gas factors. So we took our investments and normalized them for 2017 to 5.5 billion. And then all carbon footprints are activity factors times the greenhouse gas intensity, which gets the footprint. So about $5.5 billion times we used, again, this is very simple. We used the carbon intensity of the S&P 500, which is 126.25, which gets us to almost 700,000 tons of our investment footprint. And Beth mentioned there's a more detailed and granular way where you look at different industries. I've been in touch with our investment officer. We're sort of in the process of starting that, but it's not done or quite ready to share yet. I want to give a little bit of the backstory about investments, because these for certain organizations are a big deal. The good news is that this is from BlackRock. Investment sector is probably the most mature carbon net zero pledge outside of countries. So this chart is from BlackRock. It shows that as of the end of 2021, more than 85% of countries have net zero goals. For financials, it's more than half. Companies are maybe 40%. Healthcare, based on the data point of the HHS pledges, maybe is down here somewhere. But the good news is that in the investment world, this has been a hot topic for years. Their reporting is robust. And so the degree to which you engage the individuals in your organizations involved with investments, this data is accessible, and they're pretty mature tools and processes to give you the information. Again, this is from BlackRock. What are the drivers of that in the investment world? It's pink boxes are drivers. You can see decision makers and transition approaches that go through channels to outcomes. So really, society is demanding, and in the investment world, being a capitalist system, we have shareholders that can be activists and ask what companies are doing around the issue of carbon and other environmental, social governance issues. And we're wanting carbon disclosure and carbon improvement. That's what society is saying. And then there's technology levers and policy changes that are also involved in driving change, such that companies are really being driven to change by the owners of their companies. And they're looking at the fundamentals, what's feasible, in the same way that Beth shared about transitioning energy usage and energy efficiency in healthcare. All companies are looking at how they can transition price carbon and decarbonize, and incorporate that kind of in the pricing of their businesses and how they run their businesses. So a very mature and huge trend. Many of you probably read stories about this in the news. The benefit for us as healthcare systems is that we can tap into that knowledge and use it to drive our own carbon footprint around investments. Another driver in the sector, by the way, I think about 80% of US healthcare is not for profit, which means we don't have investors, right? Our boards do not answer to shareholders. We're not for profit entities that ultimately respond and try to generate community benefit. We all issue bonds. So Moody's is one of our bond rating agencies, and they have been now rating E, S, and G issues. This is a public enterprise that they're doing, and they're really looking at, and so this is another lever for change for all of you on the call in a healthcare system of different sizes and shapes. 5 years ago, sustainability was not a part of our finance deck. In the last year, the space that our work has in the finance presentation to investors has tripled in size because people are asking questions about carbon, asking how we measure it and manage it. I provide that information to our finance team and the bondholder investors that are interested in it. And Moody's is rating both E, S, and G factors for healthcare. And this is going to be an influence on our debt rating, which means basically the rate at which our organizations can borrow money. And from an environmental perspective, these are the 5 things they're looking at. Physical climate risk means, is really climate resilience. Wildfires, hurricanes, storms, what's the risk to your physical facilities? Because obviously that impacts the ability for our organizations to generate cash flow to pay off bonds. But carbon transition is primarily really what we're talking about today in that, do you understand your carbon footprint? Are you measuring it? And how are you managing it? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff here that I don't have time to go through, but environmentally, they're looking at water, waste, and natural capital as well. So ESG influence from a bond rating sector is massive. And these are just a couple snippets that Moody's put out on Cleveland Clinic's debt. And our ESG goals, management, and performance is having influence on these bond ratings that are publicly shown. These are from 2021. So our work, is elevated in terms of its importance impact on how our organizations are run on a day-to-day basis. In terms of levers for change, I'm going to talk about activity factor. So what can we do around the actual amount of money that we manage? And then there's the intensity. So in terms of investment activity, in terms of investment performance, so you might think, well, boy, if our investments go up 20%, our carbon footprint goes up. And that's not entirely true. What really matters is the performance of things we've invested in relative to the carbon intensity, right? So as Matt shared, our investments are really tiny little investment pieces of all these companies. As their price goes up, the value goes up. But if the carbon goes up at the same rate, then there's no change. It may be as the stock market goes up, carbon doesn't change much, and actually the GHG intensity goes down. So not a one-to-one relationship. It's complicated, but it's not as direct as you might think. Hopefully all of our organizations are getting contributions every year. When we get philanthropic contributions, those are put into work that increases our footprint. So it's just something we have to think about as we continue to grow and change. From the GHG intensity side, Beth mentioned this, right? So we can, the levers for change here are, we can shift to lower intensity carbon sectors. So Beth mentioned they don't invest in coal. She mentioned kind of the role that most carbon intense sectors play. I'm in discussion with our own investment team about an ESG policy that might speak to this. We've not set anything in stone yet, but that's the way our investment team works. We have an internal team. We have a chief investment officer. They allocate our money into different modes of money management and then different industries. That's kind of their job, is to set the way money's invested. They then pick money managers and people that put that money to work in different ways. We do have certain specific investments. For example, certain organizations invest in, say, an oil or a gas well, because that can generate a stable cash flow. So there may be just specific investment choice points that we can influence as a part of this. So that's really investments. It's a huge thing. It's an evolving thing. And the good news is that there's pressure not only for us but really from the entire sector on our investment management teams to understand and manage this. So my approach has really been to align with those goals and trends, and sort of highlight, we're in 3 countries. We're in Abu Dhabi, UK, and the US. All those countries have GHG and net zero goals. So really aligning our activity towards what's happening in the markets and the patients that we serve. Employee commuting is the second biggest item we're talking about today. It's 6% of our scope 3. We use a combination of the distance-based and average data methods. We're primarily located in Ohio and Florida. So for Florida, we use the Bureau of Transportation Statistics data on how people actually get to work. In Ohio, we've done surveys for a number of years. So we use the distance-based because we understand the distances and modes by which employees actually get to work. So again, with this idea of carbon footprint being an activity factor times an intensity, what are the levers? Well, we can impact miles commuted from home to work, in theory. Work from home, actually at our Cleveland campus, we have incentives to have people live within a 5-mile radius. There's incentives to both buy and rent locally, because we want to support the city of Cleveland that our name is based upon. Better to have people living here. And then short distance work has a benefit of, if there's bad weather of different types, it's easier for them to sort of get to and from work. So really, those are the 2 factors on the activity side. On the GHG intensity side, it's commute mode. How can we shift people? People love to drive their cars by themselves to work. How do we change that and get sort of more preferable ways of commuting? So we have incentives. I'll talk about that. And then, as Beth mentioned, there's this massive shift that's going to take place in the next decade plus from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. How can we support that? So we've done a number of surveys over the years, and this is from a Cleveland Clinic commuting caregiver survey. We surveyed a lot of different things, but this is just interesting in that caregivers typically commute, not shockingly, in the morning, because we have a shift-based model in a hospital. So people sort of arrive from 6 to 9, most of them at 7 or 8, and they leave between 3 and 6, right? So understanding those times better influences kind of the different modes of transportation available to support those commutes. We ask questions of a variety of type, including when they travel and why, but also what is the biggest influence over your decision to travel a certain way. You can see the 3 biggest things are travel time. People want to get to work quickly, their work shift, and the availability of a vehicle, okay? So all this data goes into influencing and changing policies that we put as an organization to try to get people out of driving by themselves in a car to work, which is reducing our employee commuting footprint. And we asked a number of questions. There's literally dozens of them. I've highlighted a couple here. With respect to public transportation, concerns are reliability and availability of transit service, and also the time. So we have a standing relationship with RTA in Ohio, which is called the Regional Transit Authority, that runs buses and trains. And we've, in certain cases, piloted different ways to try to ensure reliability, availability, and reduce travel time to our campuses using public transportation. Because in our surveys, RTA, which is again Regional Transit Authority, is the primary option for folks, as well carpooling. So it's interesting in that average data method, anyone on this call, you can access this database. This is from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. They survey on an annual basis how people get to work on a state-by-state basis. This is a national average of that information, right? So people in the US like to drive alone to work. That's that big red slice here. This is the percentage of people nationally in 2019 that drive alone to work. You can see public transportation, biking, carpooling, walking, working from home, and taxi as other modes. COVID had a massive shift, so I just thought it'd be interesting to highlight this. We've talked about it a lot, but nationally, work from home went up by more than 10 percentage points, from about 6% to 16% nationally, people working from home. And interestingly, it's not one-to-one. I've seen a variety of people kind of publish data on this. Nationally, driving alone went down by 7.2% percentage points, but public transportation and carpooling actually went down as well. So it is important that you understand the modes by which people get to work so that you can really calculate and understand the commuting impact that happens. This database, by the way, and I copied the first few states here. This is 2019 data, and you can see the link here to get the data. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics, biking, carpooling, driving alone, public transportation, taxi, walking, work, and home by state. And the latest data they actually have is 2021. Ohio, where 50,000, more than 50,000 of our 70,000 caregivers live. Work from home went up by 10 points. It was less a thing in 2019, but it went up similarly to national averages. And drive alone went down almost similarly. Carpool and public transportation were impacted as well. So this is a survey that we do annually in Ohio. And I share this just because frankly, I find it quite fascinating that we do this every 2 years. So we're going to do this again in the fall. And we happen to do a survey during the COVID years. So forever, pretty much, we've been locked in about 85% drive alone, very similar to the state averages. We did a survey in 2020 of how people get to work, and you can see January and February, there was a massive shift. People started working from home, right? And you can see that as services were shut down, all different kinds of people started doing virtual visits. Administration were home in April and May of 2020. You can see it kind of creeping back up. And the main thing that was impacted is driving alone went down and working from home went up. And you can see the parallels there. One thing that we've been mindful of is the fact that when you're doing surveys, for many years we've done them electronically. This survey, which we did, was actually done a paper version as well, because you can see that electronic responses for people that can use a computer. You get this picture of transportation, a paper survey for people that don't have as much access to computers during the day-to-day, or frontline workers. It's a very different response. So you can see that paper responses, drive alone is, between 60 and 70%, but the usage of bus and public transportation is much higher. And fascinatingly, it didn't change during COVID. This is 2020 data. Our EVS and nutrition workers and other frontline workers, transportation is a bigger issue for them. They have less optionality around this. So really the way that they get to work did not change during 2020. We have a handful of policies in place that are available for our caregivers. If you carpool to work at Cleveland Clinic, if Beth and I worked at Cleveland Clinic, both of us carpooled, we'd get a 50% discount off parking rates. If there's a carpool for a group of 4, they park for free. We have there's a discount for fuel efficient vehicles. You get a lower parking rate if you drive what the EPA calls a SmartWay Elite vehicle. The reason we do this is not only for carbon, but also because you produce less air emissions, which makes our patients healthier. We offer an electric vehicle purchase incentive, $1,000 for new vehicles and $500 for used. We promote public transportation, and we also, in the degree to which we can, promote biking with a map of bike stations, as well as showers and things for bikers to clean themselves. Beth mentioned EV. We're promoting the building of EV stations across our enterprise. Ohio is kind of in the middle in terms of charging stations. This is ports per electric vehicle. At the moment, there's 17 and a half EVs per port for this data from 2021. So we've applied for state grants and come up with a partner to build EV charging stations across our footprint. This is the first one that went in the ground, which is why I have a picture of this one. And we're trying to make the ability as a service for people that like their vehicles, allow them to charge their vehicles, whether they're caregivers at work or individuals who are patients in our facilities. Impact from COVID, we reduced the equivalent of 7,500 full-time workers. So we've gone to either some administrative services now work entirely from home, Some have a hybrid model. I'm here 3 days a week and home 2 days a week. The impact of that was basically reducing the commutes of the equivalent of 7,500 employees. That's 52 million miles driven. It reduced our commuting carbon footprint by 10%. So as much as I'd love to say that these policies had a massive impact, frankly, COVID shifted things radically and to some degree permanently around employee commuting. And I'm sure it has for your organizations as well. Fuel and energy is 3% of our scope 3. We get the data from this for our utility bills. We have a bill pay service that automatically loads them into the EPA's portfolio manager. So for electricity and natural gas, that's where we get the data. For the fuels, we get it manually. We do have a centralized fleet group that gives us the information on gas, diesel, and fuel oil purchases. I'm showing my math here. This is our data about upstream purchased fuels and electricity emissions. These are the activity factors that we've collected: gallons of fuel and therms of natural gas, greenhouse gas factor that we use. And for electricity, it's kilowatt hours and GHG intensity. What becomes quite obvious is that it's all about natural gas and electricity, really, right? So 14,000 tons of natural gas upstream emissions on top of our scope 1 and 2, and 34,000 for electricity, using a similar factor as what Dr. Eckerman shared earlier. And then for transmission distribution losses, we have a 5% loss factor, so that's another 15,000. We add both of these together, they're 4% of our scope 3, okay? But the way that we're managing them is primarily with electricity and natural gas. We're managing through energy efficiency renewables. Natural gas, we're eliminating through electrification or purchasing offsets. And the other ones is electric vehicles, or electrification is the way that strategies we're employing for that. And we do have a plan on scope 1 and 2 that's a corollary for this to reduce our energy used on a per square foot basis for hospitals, the green bars, electrify our buildings to get rid of natural gas. And these different kind of yellows and oranges are different ways we're procuring renewable energy to change from brown power to green power. We've published a number of different strategies on energy efficiency, worked with the Better Buildings, DOE, for a number of years. These are 7 strategies that have been quite effective for us. We've taken our energy per square foot down 25%, published this through the Department of Energy's Better Buildings Challenge. And really what I'd say about this, I'm happy that we're 25%, but there's 4 large systems that all reduce energy usage 20% over a decade. Every system needs to do this now. So I encourage all of you to get your finance and operations teams engaged and start moving down this path. That's had a massive impact on our scope 1 and 2 footprint. And our fuel and energy emissions from scope 3 have gone down along with this. Waste, it's 1% of scope 3. So as Beth said, it's really primarily more about engagement and teaching than it is about carbon. But we have just to sort of put a line around engagement, we have a improvement idea called My 2 Cents, whereby caregivers say, here's my 2 cents on how we can do things better. There's enterprise initiatives, institutes, which are clinical groups, and then sort of facilities. For a period of time, I managed this program for the whole enterprise and found that 80% of ideas submitted related to waste reduction, either using less stuff or recycling. So the idea of waste is a powerful and catalytic force that any organization can leverage to try to reduce not only our waste footprint, but also get interest in other topics, including carbon. We track a lot of different waste streams, like Beth said. Here's our list. And we collect data. We at the moment do paper bills that we aggregate. Would love to get an automated system like Providence has, but we get data from our vendors, we enter them. You can see the different waste streams here. I'm not going to bother to read them. These are the 2019 tons of material, more than 30,000 tons system-wide. And this is the carbon footprint associated with that using these EPA factors. So based on the different types of waste, they have different factors associated with them.
Excuse me, John. I just want to give you
5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Justin. We publish all these every year in our annual report. If you love data, here we go. This is online, all these different things. You can see here the COVID impact, where in 2020, our usage of stuff was pretty stable. And because we started doing less stuff in 2020, our waste actually went down for 4 quarters. But really about, when it comes to carbon, municipal solid waste is almost 80% of it. Because we have more than 17,000 tons of municipal solid waste. There's a factor which is 0.63 per the EPA that we multiply, so it's 11,000 tons of carbon. I really want to highlight 2 success stories from our own program that every hospital should be working on, and many probably already are. We have a paper program that collected almost 5,000 tons of paper in 2019, and a co-mingled program that collects cans, bottles, glass, and cardboard. You can see our total waste footprint was 13,800 tons. If we abandon those programs, it would be 18,000 tons. So it's a little over 4,000 tons of impact from those 2 programs, such that our paper recycling, over 15 years when we started it, has reduced cumulatively more than 30,000 tons of carbon, which is taking more than 6,000 cars off the road or 6,000 homes. And I like this one because it sounds cool and big. Our paper recycling is equivalent of 3.8 billion smartphone charges. Our commingled recycling is a smaller carbon footprint impact, but meaningful, in that all of our commingled recycling has a carbon impact of more than taking 3,000 cars off the road or 3,000 homes, and 1.9 billion smartphone charges. Business travel is the final item that I'm going to discuss because we don't lease assets. That's not a material item for us. Business travel's 10,000 tons, actually significantly bigger than what Beth mentioned. She was about 1,500. A lot of this is because we fly to England, in the Middle East, and other international places, and air travel dominates this. I do have a little chart showing, interestingly, this went down less than you would think between 2019 and 2021 with COVID, largely because in this period we're building a hospital in London and people had to go there to support the construction of a new hospital in London. But the levers are we can travel less, do virtual meetings, and do offsets. So the final topic I want to talk about is carbon offsets. We talked about this as a topic. Carbon offsets are a portion of our plan because there are certain emissions that we'll not be able to get rid of. And all healthcare systems carbon offsets are voluntary versus compliance. And what do I mean by that? No regulatory body is saying, Cleveland Clinic, you need to buy offsets. And here's why. We're doing it because we want, and we set a goal, and they are a means of achieving that goal. Carbon markets, offsets relate to carbon markets, and where they're most effective is where there's a cap on emissions in a country or a region. So there's a cap, and every year that cap goes down. And it's really a market-based system, so that if Beth and I run a utility company and the cap reduces the amount of carbon we can emit, if I can reduce my carbon more cheaply than she can, I can sell my reduction to her, and thereby the market finds a cheaper solution than just forcing everybody to go down the same amount every year. There are carbon markets in these states in the US, so there are real carbon markets, primarily on the utility sector in the Northeast and the West Coast. Globally, there's carbon markets as well, but it does not appear that we're going to have a global cap and trade system. So it's just something to be aware of. Again, we could talk for 2 hours about offsets and carbon markets. I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch of that. These are the prices of different carbon markets. This black line is Europe, where they have a cap and trade system covering essentially utility and other sectors. This is the price. So this is, a lot of people say, what's the price of carbon? This is a way you can try to do that by looking at these mature carbon markets. In Europe, it was kind of $20 or $30. It went down for a while, and with recent interest, it's gone back up towards $50. So there's different types of carbon offsets that you can do. Planting trees, not cutting down trees. The way that farmers actually manage soil is another. You can capture more carbon in the soil. Capturing methane from unregulated sectors. For example, like big manure ponds. If there's a way of, like certain farms have manure ponds where they dump manure, if you can capture the methane and destroy it, it's environmental benefit. And also certain industrial gases, hydrofluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. So again, quality, for me, there's 4 things that need to be, if we're buying an offset, they need to be verified by an acceptable third party. There's this accounting concept of additionality, which means the carbon offset funds a project that would not have otherwise happened. Therefore, we're capturing greenhouse gases that would have gone to the air, but for this project. We want transparency and some level of permanence. And other factors for healthcare are co-benefits, which, along with capturing carbon, we want them as local as possible, perhaps a biodiversity angle, and a health equity lens is particularly important for healthcare as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I think we now are going to open things up for questions. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to hand it back to Justin to moderate our Q&A session.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, as John mentioned, now it's time for our Q&A portion. So if you would like to ask your question in the chat, you can go ahead and do that and I can ask it out loud, or you could use the raise hand feature and we can call on you if you would like to ask your question verbally. But for now, I open it up for anyone who has any questions. Yes, Cheryl Holder. Okay, try unmuting yourself now. Yeah, sorry about that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great talks, and I've learned a lot. In the waste category, since a lot of it is engagement, and I agree that it does help, have we looked at the long-term taking waste, not just from this level, but to see where it's disposed of in many of the low-wealth communities in the South and seeing the health impact and the savings there, especially if you're looking at decreasing the lead levels, decreasing some of the water contamination that those communities experience. And even with asthmatics, is there any way of putting that into the win? So you get a more immediate response that when I make these waste changes, I'm also saving a life 500 miles away.
I can respond a little bit. Thank you so much for your question. So not to make too many silos, but in terms of our carbon accounting, it wouldn't exactly fit there. For us, that fits into our environmental justice work and in our resiliency planning. So yes, we do look at that, particularly we have a community that has 3 of our hospitals and it has a waste to energy plant. So they're burning this material. And we have looked at that both for the upstream carbon emissions that comes from that electricity source and the air quality issues in that particular city. Most of our hazardous waste goes to Texas. And yeah, we have looked at some of what we can learn about that in terms of that treatment. Now that is highly filtered, that's the most expensive kind of treatment we have. So that particular one is probably not the kind of thing that you might be worried about. But yeah, we are looking at that, particularly in our environmental justice assessment that we've been doing from Alaska to Texas to find out what are the industrial issues that are causing X problems and what are the health problems, who's impacted. So neighborhoods, communities by race or poverty level. And we then partner with community partners in those cities and areas to see what we can do to just bring like some weight of the health voice. It's complicated, but yeah, that's an important part for us. It just isn't really formally part of carbon accounting, but definitely part of our overall strategy, just speaking for Providence.
That's great, Beth. I agree with everything you say. And we try to visit every location that handles our waste to try to ensure that it's not, to understand exactly what's happening. We have two things: know where to throw, which is understanding where people need to put materials in our hospital, and know where it goes, so that we actually understand and educate people what happens once it leaves our facility. I've personally visited every location in Ohio that treats our waste, and a few in Florida as well. So it's a really important issue.
Thank you, John and Beth. Dan, if you would like to ask your question.
Hi, Dan Petticourt here from Contra Costa Health System out in the Bay Area of California. One of the things we're attempting to work on is greening the OR, and I'm curious if any of you have managed to get rid of the use of desflurane as an anesthetic agent, given how horrible it is on greenhouse gas emissions, and sort of what your recommendations are to assemble a team to attempt to do that. That might be too specific.
No, really important. Anesthetic gases are a scope 1 item, but it's a really important thing. Yes, we eliminated the use of desflurane in 2010. So Cleveland Clinic has some of those acute surgeries in the world. Our main campus across the street here, I think, has the highest acuity of score of any hospital in the nation. We don't use desflurane. There's no reason to use it. So ultimately, you need the support of anesthesiologists who understand this and administrators who purchase it. It's not a simple matter, but it's very doable. I don't know, Beth, any comments?
Yeah, we have not quite eliminated it, but we're chipping away at that and reduced it so far by 70% and over 90% in one of our regions. And agreed, we have a marvelous physician leader, anesthesiologist, Dr. Brian Cheesebro, and that's really important to have a clinical partner who can head that up, do the translation with people and do some data work, and also make the case for the significant cost savings, luckily, that comes with desflurane elimination or reduction. Because that's one of it's often the case that cost savings is paired with carbon savings. That's a particularly good one. Nitrous oxide, another big problem, is much less expensive. That's our bigger problem right now. And that one is, it does reduce costs, but much less so. So work to be done on all of those everywhere. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Claire, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I was trying to reduce the glare here. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and we have a very small sustainability team, like 3 people for the UW Health System. They do a pretty amazing job, for the number. But I was curious about the resource that it takes to, do this carbon accounting, and what kind of FTE is that? Is there more than one FTE involved? And, how can we convince our health system to invest in that? Does it actually save money to do carbon accounting? And, can you save your organization money by doing that? And has that been looked at?
Dr. Eckelman, do you want to respond?
Well, oh, sure. Hi, Claire. I'm not coming at this from the inside, but I'll say that healthcare is not unique in going down this path. For decades, companies have focused on, energy efficiency projects and accounted for their energy use. And now this manifestation focused on carbon, but a lot of the same kind of efficiency targets, use on rationalizing use of resources and so on. And a lot of the implications of those projects have cost benefits. So I can't quote for you like an actual number of FTEs that's needed. I'll say as an outside consultant that does this work for other institutions, including healthcare institutions, I handle it myself as part-time. So there are so many tools out there that make the work much easier than it used to be. And we've tried to share some of those resources with you here. Some of the categories you heard from Beth and John are pretty complex, and especially if you have a sprawling organization, if you're very large. And in that case, it's really makes sense to work with a third-party consulting firm or vendor like Schneider that you heard from them. So it kind of depends. I don't know so much about the overall complexity of UW, but I imagine it's not a small job. So that's all I can offer, but maybe Beth and John have something else to say.
Well, I would say just as I said before, our data approach is that we believe that these decisions must be data-driven and evidence-based, and that's partly how you convince others, like leaders. But mostly it's how you know what's happening. It's how you actually can how can you understand how much you're saving if you're not measuring, And if you're going to measure in an organized way, you might as well add on the carbon emissions. That's been our approach. And we've done that internally. We have used expertise outside of us, but we haven't paid anyone ever to help us with that. And now it's complicated and we work very hard at it. And I have to say that we have the benefit of a wonderful data team. So there's a handful of us in the sustainability world, 4 of us, I would say, that work a lot on our data. And I only showed you a few slices of it today, but we have a full team of people at our Providence Global Center, which is in Hyderabad, India. And that's where the brains behind all of the automation and the analysis of the data that then we apply our intellectual or our knowledge about to make interpretations for people. But I kind of come back to how can you manage a significant sized program without having data? And for me, and I know that this is not available to everyone, I don't think that estimations are very helpful. They give you a number on a page, but they don't really help drive change in the organization in a number of cases. It seems obvious with electricity and energy because that's what we're most used to, but I believe that that's the case for waste and for business travel and for anything that we can actually measure and then give people evidence for and the benefits of change. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Claire, I happen to know that UW Health has made a better climate challenge commitment through the Department of Energy. So your organization is committed to measuring and managing scope 1 and 2 footprint in association with the DOE. I know that because
it's scope 3 that we're working.
scope 3 is challenging.
It's very
Right.
challenging.
So the good news is the way that the way I talk about it here is carbon's a quality metric. It's a way of measuring the quality of our care. And like any quality metric, it takes more resource to get it up and running. And then once you've got that measurement, you're just updating it as it goes. So it's a bit of a lift the first time. Frankly, the most challenging part of this is just gathering the data, which is more of an internal thing. Really, the factors and methodology that Dr. Eckelman and Beth and I shared, once you've got the data, it's reasonably straightforward, but it's good to have someone who's an expert in this sort of guide you through and create it. So those are some thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Thomas Kalla. He asked, how are you calculating % changes to your long-term goal when facilities are being purchased/sold to the healthcare organization?
We do that. We've had a number of cases, particularly of onboarding more organizations. So our baseline year is 2019, and we compare everything to 2019 every year. But say, like, for instance, we had 2 come on board in 2020, late 2020. So we count their baseline year as 2021. So we've built that into our platform so that for our ongoing carbon comparisons, that's what we're doing. It does get a little bit complicated sometimes, but we've worked around that. For sold, we have not sold any yet, but we would probably do a similar idea that it's basically retired. Now, also carbon emissions are reported for a reporting period, and Dr. Eckelman can clarify this, but you'd be reporting for a current year, for instance. So if you've already sold them, then you wouldn't include them in your report. But to look at change over time, which was your question, then you would have to, come to a strategy there for doing that. Ours has been, as I said, we have some, and we'll continue to, when we add more, to have different baselines for that particular site.
Dr. Eckelman, any comments?
Yeah, just to say the one category where this is particularly important in scope 3 is that upstream and downstream leased assets and franchises side. And so, of course, there might be a lot of churn. You might get some new space, lease some new space, or give your space to a different tenant, and that might happen halfway through the year. So the common way I've seen this done is you just amortize that amount. Let's say you have 6 months through the year, you change the space that you have. Well, you count those 6 months of emissions using half of that year's utility bills, and then you get the other 6 months from the new tenant that you have. So as long as you're working within that same reporting year, then it's fine.
Yeah, this is where things get fun in carbon accounting, because it's pretty clear in the GHG protocol, if you buy it, you own it, and you own its history. So our scope 1 and 2 goes back to 2010. So when we merge with another hospital, we own its carbon history back to 2010. And that's a pain, and it's hard, and they never have the data going back that far. So on scope 1 and 2, we get as much history as we can, and then we estimate that data back to 2010. Because our carbon footprint has not increased because we bought the hospital or merged a hospital. We own their history back to the baseline. So if a hospital gets pulled out, we pull that data out to its baseline, such that if, let's say, a notable system doubled in size because two systems, Advocate and Spectrum merged, they have their shared history going back, if that makes sense. So that's our perspective on this. It gets complicated with scope 3, frankly, simply that it's hard enough to get utility bills, let alone all this other data, but that's kind of the principle.
I'd like to say just one more thing about this topic, if I could, which is we're focused on these absolute organizational level emissions.
Yep.
But what we see coming down the pike is more measures of health quality and health delivery, so that these emissions would be normalized somehow by the number of patient interactions or bed days or something like that. So this is the kind of state of reporting as it is now, but I think a lot of us in the healthcare space, we'd like to see that these metrics can be normalized in a way that's helpful.
Yeah.
So that you can see, like, okay, my organization's grown a lot, and that growth isn't skewing well, you'll see it in the absolute results, but if you're normalizing per bed, you can really track how your kind of unit performance is going on a carbon perspective.
That's a great point. And the other thing I'll note is, if we build a new hospital, then we start the emissions based on that, because it's a new facility entirely. So anyways, so we could talk about baselining and all these things, but that's I do agree that making this data as meaningful as possible to employees in healthcare is a really important thing, as you suggest.
Thank you all. I think we have time for one more question. Dan Petticord, would you like to ask it?
Yeah, thank you. It's a question for you, Matt. Can you clarify if any of the direct operations in a leased facility are not measured as scope 3?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is no. Any direct emissions that you would count as scopes 1 or 2 in that leased facility, you would include as that scope 3 category for your
Even including things like the anesthesia example I asked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think that wraps up our Q&A portion. I just want to take a brief moment and thank all of our speakers who who spoke today about carbon accounting, especially as it relates to scope 3. And John, I'll hand it over to you for some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, especially Dr. Eckerman and Beth Schenk for Dr. Schenk for helping. We're here to try to educate, inform all of you so that we can accelerate change. Hopefully we've somewhat simplified this process and demystified it. And we're here, I'm here, we are all here to support you on your journey. So good luck to all of you. I believe the National Academy of Medicine is looking to find a way to share this down the road. So more to come on this Carbon Clinic series. It's been a delight and pleasure to work with amazing people like my two speakers, and hopefully you learned something and we ignited a little bit of positive change across the country. So thanks so much for attending, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.